The Progress of the American Negro and Slavery by Roy F. Nichols, Ph.D., Assistant Professor of History, University of Pennsylvania. Among the conditioning factors in society that make for progress, liberty is usually held to be one of the most important. Therefore, in considering the problem of the progress of the American Negro, we are confronted by the initial difficulty of advance in slavery. From 1619 to 1865, most Negroes in America were slaves and suffered all the handicaps which that social condition placed in the way of their development. In addition to this severe disadvantage, the previous social training which they had received in their original African environment did not furnish a racial experience well adapted to meeting American conditions. In spite of these obstacles, however, the Negro made progress before emancipation and made contributions to American civilization. The Negro came from Africa with a civilization very much unlike that found in the new American environment. Language and social customs were different. The Negro's conception of family was complicated by clan organization and polygamy. Private property was an institution with which he had only a limited acquaintance. In Africa, land was generally held in common. Witchcraft and superstition were pervasive, medicine men and charms were potent influences in public and private life, and signs, portents, taboos, and hoodoos, the guides of destiny. Music and a feeling for rhythm were a large factor in providing emotional outlets and produced possibilities for musical expression which are especially appreciated now. Artistic achievement there was, also, of a type which is today a center of controversy. This in brief was the African background. In disregarding the question as to its measure on the scale of the advance of civilization, it was a way of life different from that of the Anglo-Saxon. When, therefore, white traders first brought Negroes to the 13 English colonies, a tremendous readjustment was necessary. Early history. The history of the American Negro and slavery can be divided into two periods. The first extended to the beginning of the 19th century and the second from thence to emancipation. In the first period, the Negro was not brought to American shores in large numbers until after the opening of the 18th century. Advantages in the slave trade which England obtained by war, and the growing scarcity of labor in the colonies stimulated the traffic. Most of the Negroes were imported into the southern colonies where they became essential to the plantation economy which was engaged chiefly in producing tobacco and rice. Besides the necessary adjustments in acclimatization, language, and living customs, the first lessons in American civilization were in agriculture. On the plantations he learned the processes of tobacco and rice culture. In this plantation environment, too, the Negro was introduced to American social customs. He gained a somewhat hazy impression of the meaning of monogamous marriage due to the fact that slaveholders and more especially the missionaries endeavored to build up a feeling for family. But these arrangements were generally informal and were apt to be temporary. Also, the Christian religion was early presented to him. One of the chief justifications of slavery was the fact that it gave the Negro an opportunity to receive the means of salvation. Missionaries of the Anglican and other churches labored with them, and occasionally an embryo religious organization would be attempted, such as that which Cotton Mather aided in Boston in 1693. Towards the end of the period, the Baptist and Methodist churches came into prominence, and as the former was of the congregational form of organization without central governing body, and the latter a new and democratic body without social traditions, and as they both emphasized the evangelical tendency, they were the first to have Negro congregations. Negro Baptist churches were established at Silver Bluff in South Carolina and at Petersburg and Williamsburg in Virginia during the 1770s, and in 1788, the first Bryan Baptist Church of Savannah was organized. Methodist activity began in Philadelphia in 1787 when Richard Allen and Absalom Jones led the Negro membership of St. George's Methodist Episcopal Church in forming the Free African Society. However, this society soon became Episcopalian with Jones as the first Negro rector, and Allen organized another Methodist group known as Bethel Church. Toward the end of this period, further advance along the lines of organization was made when Prince Hall obtained a charter from England and organized the first Negro Lodge of Masons in 1787. Cultural progress to a very limited degree marked this era. Religion and education went hand in hand. The Negroes must know English if they were going to benefit by preaching and understand the Bible. Missionaries often combined instruction in the rudiments with the teaching of Christian principles. The experiment in Goose Creek Parish in Charleston, SC, started with a school in 1695. Ministers in Virginia and the Middle Colonies carried on educational work, and in New England, Negro children were educated with those of the whites. A very few Negroes began to appear in the professions. There are records of Negro physicians. In literature and science, we find one or two isolated figures. Phyllis Wheatley of Boston obtained some notice as a slave poetess, though her poetry was hardly more than rude versification. Benjamin Banneker, a free Negro of Maryland, gained some reputation as mathematician and astronomer, and published an almanac regularly toward the close of the 18th century. Another tendency in Negro progress was an advance toward freedom. A number of efforts toward liberty were made by the Negroes themselves. Many who were brought over proved turbulent and chafed under the restrictions of slavery. The result was an occasional plot and break for freedom. Some of these were rather formidable, as evidenced by the Cato insurrection in South Carolina in 1740 and the plot in New York City in 1741. The continual importation of Negroes provided a constant influx of unsubdued spirits to keep alive the longing for liberty. Then contemporary conditions helped. It was the Revolutionary era. The doctrines of the Declaration of Independence contained the dogma of equality and liberty. Many, like Jefferson, pondered on the inconsistency of these doctrines with the institution of human slavery. The war itself provided opportunity for some Negroes to participate effectively, and a number gained their freedom by their participation. Numerous slavehold. Influenced by these doctrines and finding slavery unprofitable as the tobacco soil wore out, freed their slaves and set them up in the world. Thus briefly has been summarized the progress which marked the first phase of the Negro's life in America. The jungle had been left behind and Western ways had been assimilated to a limited extent. But outstanding social, economic, or cultural progress was the mark of the exceptional few rather than of the many. The great mass lived a primitive life of work, with their leisure spent in an irresponsible and careless search for simple amusement or rest. As the 18th century waned, the bonds seemed to be loosening, and a large proportion of the liberties so essential to progress seemed to be destined for the Negro. About the beginning of the 19th century, however, new factors entered into the situation. The cotton gin was invented, there occurred the San Domingan Revolution, and the slave trade was abolished. The first of these produced a revolution in Southern agriculture, which, with the fact that the slave trade was soon to be abolished, caused the value and demand for Negroes as labor to increase decidedly. The cotton gin now made cotton culture profitable, and the area devoted to it was rapidly expanded. This expansion called for more slaves. The section in the Upper South where slavery had not been very profitable and where the Jeffersonians had flourished now forgot their doctrines and turned to raising slaves for Southern markets. Manumission became less common. Negroes were more closely in the bonds of slavery than ever. Along with the change of economic value of slaves came a new social condition. The Negro revolt in San Domingan during the 1790s caused great hardship to the whites on that island, and many fled to southern ports for safety. There they related their horrible adventures with no suppression of detail, and many a southern planter began to think of the horrors of a slave uprising for the next 60 years that was to be a dread more or less constant and common among slave owners. So stricter watch must be kept, closer control exercised. These events, therefore, made serious inroads upon the slave's progress toward liberty and restricted his advance. The very difficulty of the situation, however, was a stimulus and an aid for Negro enterprise. The desire to escape became greater, and many people, heretofore not particularly interested, began to consider the Negro problem. About 1830 there was a crystallization of action and opinion. A Negro, Nat Turner, attempted to organize a slave rebellion, and William Lloyd Garrison started a vigorous abolitionist campaign. These events stimulated Southern fears, Northern distaste, and Negro enterprise. The Underground Railway, an organization by which fleeing Negroes were hidden and guided on their way to Northern communities, became widespread. In this enterprise, Negroes themselves played an important part. Enterprising individuals like Josiah Henson, Harriet Tubman, and many others acted as conductors in this means of escape and guided hundreds to liberty. The number of free Negroes grew by this means, increasing from 59,557 in 1790 to 488,070 in 1860, when they comprised 11% of the Negro population. While the slaves themselves had less opportunity to advance, the free Negroes were making what they could of their opportunity. In fact, it was among the free Negroes that the most progress was made in this period. This free Negro population comprised all sorts of conditions, from planters who themselves owned Negroes to day laborers in northern cities. Some had accumulated considerable property while of course most lived from hand to mouth. Some acquired skill in trades, while the great majority contented themselves with the simplest kind of labor. Some outstanding figures appeared in spite of the fact that education unfortunately did not flourish. There was growing prejudice against it in the South and in the North, and such schools for Negroes as were in operation were located in the large cities. In spite of the fact, Negroes entered the professions. Occasionally there was a doctor, and James McCune Smith, trained in Glasgow, became quite famous. William Wells Brown, as novelist, historian, and traveler, made a name for himself. But the greatest advances were made by those Negroes laboring for the uplift of their race. Men like John B. Russwurm, who received an A.B. from Bowdoin, and the distinction of being the first Negro to achieve this prize, went into journalism and labored to stimulate race pride and desire for advancement. Russwurm began Freedom's Journal in 1827, at New York, and gradually other papers appeared. Then, too, there were organizers. The American Colonization Society had been active in a program to transport the Negroes back to Africa. For many of the Negroes who had enjoyed advantages, this was an undesirable policy, especially because of the loss of life which such a change entailed. So beginning in 1831, a national convention was held annually, starting with delegates from 5 states. They met to plan for Negro welfare and improve what conditions they could, and assembled with considerable regularity in the years prior to the Civil War. For the idea of colonization did not die out. Many Negroes were transported to Liberia, an African republic established for that purpose by Americans. Numerous individuals settled in Canada, and projects for colonization in the Niger Valley, Central America, and Haiti were undertaken by Negro leaders. Another group of Negroes interested in the welfare of their race were the propagandists for abolition, such as Charles L. Remond, and especially Frederick Douglass. Douglass was perhaps the foremost Negro of the middle century, and he cooperated actively with the white abolition leaders. He and those Negroes who had made successful advances aided greatly the propaganda of Garrison and other abolitionists, because they could point out the terrible sin of a bondage which was preventing millions from making the progress of which such men as Douglass proved they were capable. But here must be inserted a word of caution. All questions of progress are complicated by miscegenation. Many, but by no means all, of those who achieved distinction were partially of white blood. Religious and economic training. Even more successful in uplift work was the activity of religious organizations. The greatest advance in social organization made by the Negro was in religion. As noted above, there had been the obligation assumed by many of the whites to point out the road to salvation to the Negro. Religion and the church were very attractive to the Negro, especially when evangelical. Churches were established and maintained by free Negroes in the North, and many plantations held regular services, oftentimes conducted by the slaves themselves. Most denominations had some provision for traveling home missionaries. In the cities, increasing numbers of African churches were organized, and the band of Negro preachers and teachers increased. But it was not the free Negro or the outstanding achievements of the few that were typical. 89% of the 4,440,000 Negroes in the United States in 1860 were slaves, cogs in a great economic and social machine, and the great mass, whether free or slave, was not very far advanced. To the great majority, life was circumscribed in a narrow rural environment. Agriculture under close supervision was their occupation. Whether it was cotton, rice, tobacco, grain, or corn, they planted, tilled, and harvested, under supervision, with little responsibility as to the result. Relatively few had any mechanical and technical training, though many a plantation had skilled or semi-skilled mechanics among its slaves. Very many others were stable and house servants, becoming deft in the ways of providing for the white man's ease and comfort. Such was their economic training, and it lacked almost altogether any experience in or incentive to enterprise or responsibility. Socially, the farm or the plantation and the neighboring farms and plantations were the extent and limit of their horizon. To imitate their white superiors was the highest ambition, while understood to be only a relative possibility. To serve in the house or the stable, to wear livery or cast-off finery, these were valued privileges. Generally, satisfaction came from rest, bodily comfort, a carefree relationship with one's fellow Negroes, an easily fluctuating oft-traversed but rather narrow gamut of emotions provided the temperamental variety of irresponsibility. They knew the forms of family life, but the constant possibility of the breakup of families by sale did not make for the greatest stability in the institution. Religion was often their greatest outlet and their greatest joy. To sing, to hear emotional preaching, to experience the joys of conversion were precious privileges. Music and dancing were their recreation. The spirituals, their chants and choruses persisted and today are much appreciated, taking their place in American culture. Then there were dark survivals of the jungle, ghosts, enhance, spirits, witches, hoodoos. Charms such as the rabbit's foot were potent and would drive away most evils. These superstitions, traditions, fairy tales have become part of American folklore and literature. Love of display, color of any sort, trinkets, gewgaws, providing they were resplendent, appealed and caused a rich and hearty laughter which drove away all thought of servitude or bondage. After all, it was not a very marked progress in spite of the examples to the contrary. It had contributed directly but little to American progress, indirectly who knows how much. The Negro mammy brought so many of the Southern children through the years of childhood. The Negro dialect impressed itself upon the speech of the whole section. The method of work, to many seemingly wasteful and ineffective, was the chief means of production in a wide area. The question of the righteousness of slavery caused many an ardent soul and calculating politician to take a public course, which was one factor at least in bringing on a disastrous, but these results are all intricate, indirect, and imponderable. The most important fact of slavery is that the Negro, whatever his progress and whatever his contribution to American advance, was woefully unfitted for the freedom so suddenly thrust upon him. He lacked training and initiative and responsibility, and through no fault of his own, without adequate preparation or intelligent leadership and under the great handicap of prejudice, he was forced to enter a competitive economic system when he knew not the meaning of such a condition and was thrust into an organized society whose ways he had always been taught were not his ways. Because of this lack of adequate training, the history of the Negro from 1865 to the present was inevitable.